some of the themes that we're seeing. One of the first questions I think would probably a good one to start off this discussion is, how can we do a better job bringing all sides to the table to resolve these climate issues? You want to take a shot at that?
That's part of what we're doing with this White House project. It's interesting. People in industry are interested in being a part of the solution, and I've done work really both as governor and since working with CEOs of some of the biggest corporations in America who I think understand this, that the problem that we see in Congress is really the place where it's difficult to understand how you get people to work together. And I think, you know, we have a delegation that's probably better than some delegations, but I think that's the real question is, how do you motivate the constituencies out there? And we think business as a constituency is really important in this conversation, because the number of CEOs who understand, I think what you were talking about, Administrator, the connection between the economy and issues around climate change, global warming, get them to the table to say to people that, you know, they listen to, the people in Congress who listen to them, say this is an issue and we need policy levers in place. The intractable nature of the political discussion in Congress is maybe the single biggest threat to our ability as a nation to act in a meaningful way. And so bringing people to the table says, let's bring the stakeholders. We had, and Tisha was a part of this, we had people from the environmental community, from the natural gas industry, from the trade associations, from academia, from the regulatory, and we had a civil conversation over a dinner and then the next full day around a set of pretty contentious issues. And framing was a part of conversation, how important it was not to use, you know, language that somehow sort of triggered emotions, as opposed to just like, what's the serious dialogue in this country that needs to take place, and how can we convince lawmakers that this dialogue is possible, and that people who support them on other places in economic development actually support them acting in a meaningful way in energy. That's that. We have to elevate the political intensity of energy and environment. It has to mean as much to the American people as jobs do.
So a key component of framing is being aware of how much we characterize all important conversations in an us versus them environment. And fundamentally, whenever there's a them, any other, any they, we are ceasing to take responsibility for our role. It's going to be much more productive when we say, I require energy, I demanded it at an affordable price, and I'm going to join the conversation about it. Those they people are part of us, and we're going to make a lot more progress when we start approaching these problems as we. The second thing I'll say is that once you get to the table, the thing about polarization in this country right now is that no actual meaningful work is getting done. The work doesn't begin till you get to the table. And that's actually where it's messy and difficult and painful and emotionally draining, and you have to make compromises. And so first we have to get to the table, but then we need to empower our policymakers, our representatives, to compromise, to find creative solutions. Compromise can no longer be a dirty word. It's preventing us from doing anything.
So I've always wanted the federal government to ride to the rescue here, and I suppose that's in large part because when you have uncles like Stuart Udall and fathers like Mo and a Congress that works well and the federal government does all kinds of cool things, you think they're going to solve your problems. But it was pointed out recently to me that every major environmental act that we have at the federal level came from the bottom up. It did not start at Congress, it started with people. And I think many of us who wanted the federal government to ride the rescue here have been betting on the wrong horse. That this really is a local issue, despite the fact that it's global implications. And if you really want to see change come about, you've got to have your own local experiments. And that's why this community is an interesting place to be, as well as to watch states, for example, like California, where they do interesting things. And Governor Clean Air, Clean Jobs was an unbelievable attempt to bring that home right to the state and local level. That's the best thing you did on your watch, and probably the best thing that's been done in Colorado for years on this.
let's continue on that theme. There was a question that was asked, what are we doing in Colorado that you see as valuable tools, experience efforts that will help inform the national climate effort? So you can pick up a little bit more on what are we doing here in Colorado to address these issues?
Well, I'd say, first of all, we increased the amount of wind, and I understand your point about wind and life cycle analysis is important, but we had a lot of naysayers when Mark Udall, along with Lola Spradley, said we need to go to a 10% renewable energy standard. People said, this is in 2004, it was on the ballot because we couldn't get it passed through the State House. And people said, no, we don't have enough energy to get to 10%. It's going to be way too expensive. You can't integrate it into the present-day grid. Xcel, as a company, was actually a utility, was opposed to it, and we got to 10%. We're headed to 10% at lightning speed after 2004. And so 2007, we went to 20% and said we're going to protect ratepayers with a 2% rate cap. We're going to put in a 20% renewable energy standard. We're going to set a date of 2020. And by 2010, we said we can go to 30 and keep a 2% rate cap, and we can, integrate it into the grid. And there were still the same sort of naysayers coming along. During the downturn in Colorado, the one sector that actually grew was the clean tech, clean energy sector. Now, I am a person who believes natural gas is part of a clean energy economy. So when I talk about wind, I'm not saying I'm a wind out and I'm a champion, but one of the things that we've done is a true all of the above strategy that says we're going to wrap our strategy around emissions. We're going to find a clean energy solution. So we've got this way of actually demonstrating to other states the things that we were talking about, so we're going to product of false choices. And so that's important. The second thing that I think we're doing with uneven success is demonstrating that the natural gas economy can survive even with good regulations in place and a strong sort of regulatory effort. There's a debate about how strong those regulations currently are or need to be, what kinds of things technological advances can do to improve upon that. But to Tish's point, this is actually a worldwide conversation, and there's this company in Ukraine that says we're going to develop natural gas in Ukraine. We know that the country doesn't have adequate rules in place, so we're following the state of Colorado's rules. Because we believe that their regulatory framework is important and adequate and strong. I think industry needs to embrace strong rulemaking sort of as a way to say we're part of this clean energy economy. So that's the thing that I think we're doing in Colorado, is demonstrating you can actually do this and still have affordable, clean power.
Sure, I think that this conversation about all of the above really emphasizes the point that I was trying to make, which is that energy being characterized as either wearing a halo or wearing horns is irrelevant. In Colorado, we can use renewables because we have strong resources for natural gas, and we also have strong oil resources, which when produced closer to home are more efficient in terms of the energy expenditure to get those to the ultimate end user. One of the things I mentioned in my talk, which I think is really important because most people don't know, you start talking about air emissions and immediately you want to go to sleep, and I totally understand. But the NSPS Quad O, which is a name designed to put you to sleep, is in fact based on a lot of the work that we've done here. And so we know that we can reduce methane emissions in oil and gas operations. We've demonstrated that, and in fact we are a national leader in ensuring that we're innovating, we're cost effective, we can do these things without increasing energy costs for the ultimate end users. And so Colorado is a place where partners are coming together to look at these solutions. We're a proud partner in Clean Air, Clean Jobs. We were a proud supporter of the NSPS Quad O rules, which are coming into rulemaking in Colorado this year. And you're going to see that the oil and gas industry is your partner in addressing climate change, if you'll just notice that we're actually at the table and make a little room for us.
Reggie?
I would say, Governor, at the end of 2010, we did a project for you called the Colorado Climate Preparedness Project. And we tried to go out and look at what state agencies were doing with regard to preparing for all kinds of climate. And one of the lessons that came out of that from looking at other states was that the governor has got to take the lead on adaptation within the state. He's the person who sets the tone. And Governor Hickenlooper has waded into this. He's doing good. I would suggest he could do better. I think my old entity, the Western Water Assessment, is actually now underway doing a new report along the lines of that old one. I would suggest that we could look, for example, at California, where they do an annual climate change impacts indicator report, and they look at all kinds of sectors and see what's been changing. That's at least part of it. That's the input, but then you really need the action. And finally, let me just suggest, this has got to be cross-sectoral. It's got to be embedded in almost everything we do, sort of like NEPA. I mean, that's sort of, it needs to be part of every decision that you make. And it needs to come from, the leadership needs to come from the top.
That's great.
So no surprise, there were a number of questions that came in on fracking, and rather than try to read them all, I think what I would ask is try to pull them together and ask the question of what can be done about the impacts of fracking with regard to air emissions, the question specific to methane gas, what can be done about the impacts to water, those kinds of questions were asked.
I'm sure you're just looking at me. Okay, you're giving me 45 minutes to answer this, right? So first I want to acknowledge that there are very important and very valid conversations and concerns happening about oil and gas development across Colorado. And at risk of getting gonged off the stage, I'll just be very brief in my remarks, but I will make myself available if you would like me to come in and talk to your group at more length. So the first thing is fracking is a word that is being used as a synonym for oil and gas development. So that's how I'll use it here. Hydraulic fracturing is a very specific part of oil and gas development. But I assume when you're articulating concerns, you're articulating concerns about oil and gas development in your community. 95% of all wells in Colorado have been hydraulically fractured, so really oil and gas development is synonymous with having to have hydraulic fracturing happen in your well. So Colorado does have some of the most comprehensive regulations in the country, and I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, and I heard the concerns when we talk about other countries adapting our rules, but that is happening. And if you haven't read them, it's worth reading them because they cover everything from when a well is sited to drilled through hydraulic fracturing and ultimately to final reclamation and closure. And so oil and gas development is comprehensively regulated by not just the state but federal agencies. And so since we're talking about air today, I'll just mention that briefly. EPA's Clean Air Act, sometimes you hear that the oil and gas industry is exempt from the Clean Air Act. That's simply incorrect. The Clean Air Act is administered by EPA and it is delegated to the state, to the CDPHE. And so the oil and gas industry is subject to all the Clean Air Act rules and very comprehensive rules focusing on oil and gas development and addressing fugitive and methane emissions. That rulemaking is underway right now. It's extraordinarily important. It's important to all of us. And so I want you to know that oil and gas is regulated under the Clean Air Act, and ultimately the industry is accountable to those laws. So that's one of like 1,000 questions that you have, but unless we're going to change the forum, I'll...
So and I'll add something to that. The Environmental Defense Fund looked at what's really a stunning gap in the research around what are called methane leakage or fugitive methane. The industry doesn't like fugitive methane because it denotes a one-armed guy, you know, running around from the FBI. So this is called methane leakage, right? And so there's places saying, oh, the leakage is 1%. There, you know, a study out of Los Angeles Basin saying 17%, a recent study out of the Uinta Basin in Utah that said it was 10%. And so the Environmental Defense Fund says we've got to do something. And so partnering with industry, with the University of Texas, with Colorado State University, I think with Rutgers. Colorado State has the midstream and the processing plants. UT has the wellbore. We hope we have a definitive study coming on what really the rate is and some ability to know. The EPA is working on this in a really big way, and we appreciate that, Administrator, because we don't know, given the research that's out there, but we do need to know. And we need to know because we need to know what technology is necessary to keep the methane leakage rates both at the wellbore and along the midstream, at the processing plants and at the smokestack, keep them to a place where we can utilize natural gas as part of a climate solution.
Brad, since you got left out of this one, that last question, I think this one might be one that you'll want to jump on. It's what kind and how many jobs will this make available for young scientists?
You know, climate change is a growth industry, right? It's unlimited. I wish it weren't true, but there's plenty of opportunity out there.
Anybody other like to jump in? Senator Udall had mentioned the carbon tax, and there were a number of questions that came in on that. One specifically to Tisha of where your industry might come down on that, but I think more broader questions about views on a price for carbon.
Sure, so it's not often people ask the Colorado oil and gas representative for policy recommendations on climate change. This might be a first.
We should do it more often.
Right. Among a panel like this, I think it would be pretty presumptuous of me to be offering what I think are ultimately the solutions required for climate change. I think the important thing, as the governor alluded to, is the process. And the process right now is exclusive largely of the sides coming together. So people are in their camps and they're waving their sabers around, but we're not having meaningful conversation because in both cases, there's a villain. And if you sit in the oil and gas industry, villains can look like people who are trying to affect your business and not appreciative of the energy that you're providing. And obviously, if you're sitting in your seats, I get to wear the villain hat. So I don't know where the industry is going to come down, but it's going to come down in a heck of a lot better place if we're partners, if there's room for the oil and gas industry to be part of the solution.
So I'm part of a group, it's a National Academy of Sciences panel, and our deliberations are confidential, but our public meetings are not. So we just had a public meeting 2 weeks ago. Representative Joe Barton from Texas said to us, and are making recommendations as part of this NAS, do not consider a price on carbon is a recommendation. And you know, he said it's off the table, and I don't think it should be off the table, right? It should be there in a consideration. Whether it's the best thing. But what should be on the table is this way of framing energy issues around sort of environmental, not sort of, but around environmental concerns, economic development, and how you protect people who pay electricity rates, industries that pay electricity rates. How do you sort of work on something that kind of gets at all these things? And to take one thing like a carbon price on carbon fee, take it off the table is absolutely wrong as policymakers of this country. And so I think it should be on the table. They say, you know, Waxman-Markey failed. There were Congress people, they say, who lost elections because they voted for Waxman-Markey. There may be that cap and trade is not going to be part of the congressional vernacular for a while. But if we don't think about broad policy issues and say, let's put everything on the table, and let's really decide this based upon this framework around an energy economy that's fair to ratepayers, we're going to have a problem moving at this federal level. And I think what Brad said earlier, that it becomes incumbent upon those who work at the local and state level to be as aggressive and as pushy as possible.
We have time for one more question, and then hopefully we'll have a minute left for any last comments that the panelists would like to make. This question gets to both adaptation and to the science. What is your perspective on how climate change is and will impact communities in the West, and what do we know and not know? That last part being, I think, a pretty interesting question.
You know, there are several places in the world that get identified as hotspots on climate change. And they happen to sit at about 30 degrees north and south. And one of those hotspots is the American Southwest. These hotspots tend to be real close to existing deserts. So the big Great Australian Desert is part of this. The Mediterranean area is part of this. And the American Southwest is part of it. This is due to more or less basic climate science and how the circulation of the Earth works. And I think that does not bode well for potentially this area, although we sit slightly north of it, but certainly for the Mojave, Sonoran desert complex where Arizona, Southern California, and New Mexico sit. And we're already seeing many of these impacts. And so that's, I think, in some sense, my real worry. The Colorado Rockies it's very hard within our climate models to discern what's going to happen here. But I am nervous just because of our proximity to these deserts that we do think get hotter and drier So that would be.
Just the what we don't know.
What do we don't know? We don't know a lot. And I think we tend sometimes fool ourselves with the science. There's a terrific paper on uncertainty by Nick Stern, who wrote the Stern Review in the UK, and a guy by the name of Lenny Smith, who occasionally comes here. It's absolutely worth a read. And I think as humans, we tend to fool ourselves on what we think we know. This beast we're dealing with is going to throw all kinds of left hooks and right punches at us in ways that we can't anticipate. And we've seen a bunch of them already. When people talk about 20% declines in the Colorado River, I think we really lose sight of the potential for pretty radical short changes that aren't just sort of a nice linear decline to some new state that we can actually handle. The literature is quite clear that adaptation is far more difficult to these extreme events that come quickly because you just don't have time and you don't foresee them. And I think that's our challenge, to kind of think big enough about how this might unfold in front of us.
Let's go to a quick wrap if we could. Tisha, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Sure, I'll say them in response to the question. So last week we had our Rocky Mountain Oil and Gas annual conference, and the theme was history. And 5 years ago, we did not know that the oil and gas industry domestically in the U.S. would revolutionize energy dynamics worldwide and make the United States the only large economy that's reducing its carbon emissions worldwide. So we don't know what the next technology innovation will be. And if we can set aside our energy bias and focus on energy effectiveness, what's going to be the right combination of efficiency and density and low emissions and affordability and transportability, because we got to get this stuff around the world. If we can focus on energy effectiveness and be investing with equal passion into research and development into energy solutions in whatever form they may come, that is as or more important than how we address this climate tax question. Because what we don't know is what solutions are out there waiting to be found, discovered, and put into implementation.
Governor, any closing comments?
No, I've said enough, but other than to say, Administrator McCarthy, you have a tough job ahead of you. And no, I'm very serious. I think your predecessor, your predecessor, Lisa Jackson, also had a very difficult time. You should know there are people here that support you, support your efforts, and will do anything we can to make sure you're successful. So God bless you.
So, Administrator McCarthy, I actually have a question for you. First off, I want to thank you. Without you, this whole event doesn't happen, and you saw the intense interest here. Thank you so much. So, you were quoted recently, and it says you studied both primitive cultures and primates, and you say this has prepared you well for your current task. Is that true?
Yes.
Well, please help me in thanking our panelists for